Which of the world's wiseacres, I wonder, was responsible for the aphorism that the best things in life are to be found at its edges? It's too vague, of course. So much depends on what you mean by best and edges. Most of us prefer the central. It is safe. You know where you are. But amusing? Well, hardly. Quite so, as my friend Mr. Bloom would have said. But then Mr. Bloom has now ventured over the borderline. He is, I imagine, interested in edges no longer. I've been reminded of him again, as if there were any need, by an advertisement in the Times. It announces that his house, Montresor, is for sale. This charming freehold residential property, 38 acres, the matured grounds of unusual beauty, I don't deny it. But was it quite discreet to describe the house as imposing? A pair of slippers in my possession prompts this query. It is important in such matters to be clear and precise, and, alas, all I can say about Mr. Bloom can only be vague and inconclusive, as indeed he was. It was an afternoon in May. I'd been to see a friend who, after a long illness, was now creeping back into the world again. It is a relief to leave a sick room, to breathe freely again after that stagnant atmosphere. I even found myself whistling as I climbed into my two-seater. I released the brake. She leapt to life. I felt adventurous. It would be miserably unenterprising to go back by the way I'd come. I would just chance my way home. 2 or 3 miles further on, I caught my first glimpse of Mr. Bloom's house, of Montresor, and the mere quiet, diffident looks of it brought me instantly to a standstill. Imposing. It must have been built around 1750, and at second sight was merely of pleasing proportions. To all appearance, it was vacant. High-grown trees towered around it, chiefly chestnuts. The sun had set, and a diffused light hung over the walls and roof. I had been debating whether to approach nearer on foot or to drive boldly in. I chose the second alternative, with a faint notion in my mind perhaps that it would ensure me, if necessary, a speedier retreat. But then premonitions are apt to display themselves a little clearer in retrospect. Anyhow, if I had walked up to the house, that night would not have been spent with Mr. Bloom. But it looked harmless enough, and I drove under the chestnut trees to the entrance. I sat on in the car, idly surveying the scene. No notice whatever seemed to have been taken of my intrusion. So presently I got out, and mooned off to the end of the shallow stone-vase terrace. Only a dense shrubbery beyond. I sighed and turned back. I came to the conclusion that the place was unoccupied. Indeed, my foot was actually on the step of the car when, as if at a summons, I turned my head and discovered not only that the door was now open, but that a figure, Mr. Bloom's, was standing on the threshold. Mr. Bloom. A memorable figure. He was well over 6 feet in height. He was both stout and fat, and his clothes hung loosely upon him. A black morning coat and waistcoat, brown trousers and well-cut boots. His head was bald, but his face was bushily bearded. He was surveying me from under very powerful magnifying spectacles. "Are you interested in my house?" he was saying. I made the lamest apologies, adding some trivial comment on the picturesqueness of the scene. But of this I am certain. The one thing uppermost in my mind, even at this stage in our brief acquaintance, was the desire not to continue it. Far from countenancing this inclination, however, Mr. Bloom was suggesting that I should come in. There was a suppressed eagerness in the eyes behind those glasses. And yet, even so, why should I have distrusted him? He pushed the door open. The glimpse within decided me. For the hall beyond was peculiarly attractive. It was panelled in light wood, the carving on its pilasters tinged with gilt. Empty, it would have been a fascinating room, but just now it was grotesquely packed with old furniture. It might have been some antique dealer's interior, prepared for a moonlight flit. But having thus enticed me in under his roof, Mr. Bloom rapidly motioned me on. At the dusky twist of the corridor, I found him awaiting me, his hand on an inner door. "This is a study," he informed me. "One moment, though. I think I neglected to shut the outer door." Dimmed old Persian rugs lay on the floor. There was a large writing table. The immense armchairs were covered in vermilion Morocco leather, and the walls were lined with books. The lofty chimney-piece was surmounted by mouldings in plaster, some pagan scene. I was looking out of the long windows when Mr. Bloom reappeared. "You are a lover of books," he was murmuring, and we were soon conversing amiably enough on the diversions of literature. At last I bluntly held out my hand, and in spite of his protestations, made my way out of the room. Mr. Bloom followed me, cooing his regrets that I could spare him no more time. "The garden, my china." I persisted nevertheless, and myself opened the outer door, and there, in the twilight, sat my car. I had actually taken my seat in it, when I noticed that in a moment of absent-mindedness I must not only have locked the gears, but that the Yale gear key was missing. I searched my pockets, leapt out and searched them again, and not only in vain, but without the faintest recollection of having even touched the key. I turned to Mr. Bloom. He was watching my efforts with an almost paternal concern. "I've mislaid the key. Is it of importance?" "It's the gear key," I snapped. "She's fixed, immovable, useless. I wish to heaven I—"
"Most vexatious, dear me. Do you think by any chance, Mr. Dash, you can have put it into your pocket?"
I stared at him. The suggestion was little short of imbecile, and yet he had evidently had the sagacity to look for my name on the licence. "Where's the nearest town?" I said.
"The nearest... let me see. Come in again, we must get a map."
I produced my own from the car, but only an owl could have read it in that light. There was no alternative. I followed Mr. Bloom into the house again, and on into his study. He lit a couple of candles, and we sat at the writing table and examined the map. The position was ludicrous. Montresor was miles from the nearest village. I folded my map and sat glooming.
"But why be disturbed?" he entreated me. "Why, a misadventure, but of no importance. You will give me the pleasure of being my guest for the night. Say no more."
I protested, and once again began searching my pockets.
"Ah, I see what is in your mind. Think nothing of it. Yes. Comforts, convenience curtailed, I agree. But my good housekeeper always prepares a meal sufficient for two. Mere habit, Mr. Dash. And I will forage for myself." He beamed. "As a matter of fact, I am preparing to leave," he told me, "as soon as it is convenient. Meanwhile, I camp on the ground floor. It amused my secretary, this system of picnicking, poor fellow, at least for a while."
He came to a standstill on the threshold of the room into which he was leading me. Candles burned on the oak table set for our evening meal.
"I must explain," he was saying, "that my secretary has left me. He has left me for good. He is dead."
He glanced over his shoulder into the corridor.
"I miss him. On the other hand, we mustn't allow our personal feelings to interfere with the enjoyment of what I'm afraid is a lamentably modest little meal."
It was by no means a modest little meal. Our cold bouillon was followed by a pair of spring chickens, the white sauce on their breasts adorned with fragments of cucumber, truffle, and mushroom. There was an asparagus salad, and neighbouring it were silver dishes of meringues and a wine jelly thickly clotted with cream. Champagne was our only wine. Between mouthfuls, Mr. Bloom indulged in general conversation of the exclamatory order. It covered a pretty wide autobiographical field. He told me of his boyhood in Montresor. The estate had been in his family for 2 centuries. For some years he'd shared it with his 3 sisters, all now dead. By the time we'd set to work on some Camembert cheese, Mr. Bloom's remarks about his secretary had become almost aggrieved.
"He was of indispensable use to me in my work. Indispensable. We differed in our views, of course. No human beings ever see perfectly eye to eye on such a topic. In a word, the occult.
He laid his left hand on the table.
"We succeeded in attaining the most curious and interesting results from our little experiments. I could astonish you."
I tried in vain to welcome the suggestion.
"My own personal view," he explained, "is that his ill health was in no way due to these investigations. My secretary, Mr. Dash, was found dead in his bed. That is, in his bedroom. Speaking for myself, I should prefer to go quickly when I have to go at all. You will agree, my dear sir, that to see eye to eye with an invalid for any protracted period is a strain. Not a happy youth, ever, but still meaning well. We shared the same interests. He had his own views, but was at times exceedingly obstinate about them. He had little staying power."
He refilled his glass.
"You know the general process, of course."
And he forthwith embarked on a long and tedious discourse concerning the uses of the planchette, of automatic writing, table tapping, and all the other paraphernalia of the spiritualistic sales. Nothing I could say or do, not even deliberate yawning, had the least effect on Mr. Bloom's fluency. Lung trouble appeared to have been the cause of his secretary's final resignation. But if the unfortunate young man had night after night been submitted to the experience I was now enduring, boredom alone would have accounted for it. The cascade of talk suddenly ended. Mr. Bloom fixed me in silence under his glasses.
"You yourself have possibly dabbled a little in my hobby?"
I had indeed. In my young days, my family had possessed an elderly female friend, a Miss Allgood. She was gaunt, loquacious, and affectionate, and she had a consuming interest in the other world. I hear her now.
"On the other side, my dear Charles. Another plane, Charles."
I used to go to tea with her occasionally, and she would bring out the little round table and the wine glass and the cardboard alphabet, and we would ask questions of the unseen, and she would become flushed and excited, while she urged me now to empty my mind and now to concentrate, and we enjoyed astonishing revelations. These spiritualistic answers to our cross-examination were at the same time so unintelligibly intelligent and yet so useless that I had been cured once and for all of the faintest interest in the other side. I explained this to Mr. Bloom. I don't say that you get nowhere, but my personal opinion is that the whole business is a silly and dangerous waste of time. His eyes never wavered.
"Quite so, but not exactly. Nowhere, it may be."
And then as I sat looking at him, his face went out, so to speak. It became vacant. The unspeculating eyes remained open, but he, Mr. Bloom, was gone. And for perhaps 2 minutes I sat there in a solitude I do not covet to experience again. Yet, as I realized even then, Mr. Bloom had succeeded in this miserable maneuver merely by a trick. The next instant his bluish eyes became occupied, and he looked at me with a leer of triumph. He gave me no time to reflect on this piece of buffoonery.
So, he was informing me. "Shut us up or shut us down. We are what we are. And what you've been saying, my dear Mr. Dash, amuses me." "Extraordinary. Most amusing."
"Quite so. Like a fool I mentioned Miss Allgood."
"I see. A superannuated novice. You pay your money and you take your choice. Pooh, banal."
I hotly defended my old friend.
"Ah, indeed, an old maid. Have no fear, Mr. Dash, she is not on my visiting list."
With that he took out his watch, a gold half-hunter.
"Now, let me see. 9 o'clock. Just 9. We have a long evening before us. Believe me, I am exceedingly grateful for your company, and regret that. But I see you've already condoned an old man's foibles."
There was something curiously aimless, even pathetic, in the tone of that last remark. He rose from the table, with one of the candlesticks in his hand. In his study, a dusky moonlight loomed beyond the windows.
"And now, Mr. Dash, Your room. Where shall we be put?
He stood looking at me.
My secretary's now? But one has reluctances, perhaps. I myself sleep in here.
He stepped across and drew aside a curtain hung between the bookcases. But there was not light enough to see beyond.
The room I propose is also on this floor, so we should not, if need be far apart. Eh? What think we? Well, now, come this way.
He led me out to a room along the corridor. It was a bed and a sitting room combined, and its curtains and upholstery were of pale purple. The bed was in a corner by the window, and there again the dusky moonlight showed. This was the last place on earth. These walls, these colours, this bookcase, that table, which Mr. Bloom's secretary had set eyes on before setting out, not to return.
How's that, then? My host watched me.
I mumbled my thanks.
Capital, cried Mr. Bloom. Eureka! My only apprehension. Well, you know how sensitive people can be. I leave you reconciled, then, my dear Mr. Dash. You will find me in the study.
He lit the candles on the writing table and withdrew. I took one of the candles and glanced at the books. They were chiefly of fiction and a little poetry. On the writing table were a couple more, and a black book, its cover stamped diary, and on the flyleaf, SS Champneys. I turned to the last entry, dated just months before. Just a few scribbled words. Not me, at any rate. Not me. But even if I could get away for... The ink was smudged, a mere scrap of handwriting, and that hasty smudge of ink. They resembled an incantation. I shut the book and turned away. To my astonishment, a log fire was burning handsomely in the grate when I returned to the study, and Mr. Bloom, having drawn up two of his voluminous armchairs in front of it, was now encased in one of them.
"I hope," was his greeting, "you found everything needful, Mr. Dash. In the circumstances, not that you wouldn't find a complete trousseau in the wardrobe. My secretary, in fact, was inclined to the foppish. No blame, no blame. Fine feathers, Mr. Dash."
It is, thank heaven, an unusual experience to be compelled to spend an evening as the guest of a stranger one distrusts. Mr. Bloom did his best to make himself amusing. We discussed music and art. We talked of chance and dreams and disease and heredity, edged on to woman, and skated rapidly away. In the midst of a discourse on the progress of human thought, he suddenly inquired if I cared for the game of backgammon.
"And why not? Or solitaire, Mr. Dash, a grossly underestimated amusement."
But all this badinage, these high spirits, were clearly an elaborate disguise. He was keeping it up, to keep me up. And his attention was divided. One, at least, of those long, hairy ears was cocked in another direction. And at last the question that had been on my tongue most of the evening popped out almost inadvertently. I asked if he was expecting a visitor. At the moment, his back was turned on me. He was rummaging in a cupboard for glasses to accompany the decanter of whiskey he had produced. His head turned slyly.
"A visitor? Here? Now? You amuse me. Callers? Oh, thank heaven, not so. You came, you saw, but you did not expect a welcome. The unworthy tenant of Montresor took you by surprise, confess it. And why not? What if you yourself were my looked-for visitor? What then? Yes, I agree. I was on the watch. Patiently. In due time your charming little car appears at my gate. You pause. I say to myself, here he is. Company at last. Discussion, powwow, even controversy, perhaps. Why not? I step downstairs, and here we are.
I assured Mr. Bloom that if it had not been for the loss of my key, I shouldn't have stayed 5 minutes. He chuckled.
Howard, are we not forgetting that such little misadventures are merely part and parcel of the general plan?
What general plan?
Mr. Dash, pray let us no longer treat each other like witnesses in the witness box. Have a little whiskey? Pure malt? A tot? One of the few exasperating things about my poor secretary, Mr. Champneys, was his aversion to alcohol. His own word. £300 a year, Mr. Dash, no less. And everything found. Soda water or Apollinaris?
In sheer chagrin, I drank the stuff and rose to turn in. Not a bit of it. With covert glances at his watch, Mr. Bloom kept me there until it was long past midnight, and try as he might to conceal it, the disquietude that had peeped out earlier in the evening became more and more obvious. Once he raised his hand and openly sat listening.
Tell me, Mr. Dash, was I deceived into thinking I heard a distant knocking? In a house as large as this, articles of some value, we read of violence.
I inquired with clumsy irony if there would be anything remarkable in a knocking. Don't your friends from the other side ever volunteer a rap or two on their own account?
A rap or two? He echoed me blandly, but his lips trembled.
I had had enough, and this time had my way. He accompanied me to the door of the study and held out his hand.
If by any chance you should want anything in the night, you will remember where to find me. I'm in there, he pointed, and now our evening is at an end. But who knows? Never matter. What must come, comes.
At last I was free. I made my way to Mr. Champneys' bedroom and locked the door. The one thing in my mind was relief at finding myself alone again. No talker has ever more completely exhausted me than Mr. Bloom. Half-dressed, I lay down on the bed, drew its purple quilt over me, after all, Mr. Bloom's secretary had not died in it, and blew out my candle. I must have at once fallen asleep. And now, as if in a moment, I was awake again, wide awake. Night had gone, the creeping grey dawn was at the window. I lay there, stiff and cold, eyeing the door. And then I heard the sound of voices at a distance. At that, a deadly chill came over me. I stepped soundlessly onto the floor, looked about me, but in vain in the half-light for the coat I had been wearing the previous night, and slipped on instead a pair of Mr. Champneys' slippers and the silk dressing-gown that hung on the door-hook. In these I was not exactly myself, but at any rate ready for action. I unlocked the door. The voices were more distinct now. One of them, I fancied, was Mr. Bloom's, but there was a curious similarity between them. It might have been Mr. Bloom talking to himself. I listened, but could detect no words. And then the talking ceased. There came a thump, and then, overhead, the sound as of someone retreating towards me. Inaction is unnerving, and yet I hesitated, detesting the thought of meeting Mr. Bloom again. But that risk had to be taken. I tiptoed along the corridor and looked into his study. The curtain between the bookcases was drawn aside. I crossed the room and looked in. Beside a chair on which a black morning coat had been flung was a small bed, half covered by a rug, and standing next to it a familiar pair of boots. On a table lay the miscellaneous contents, obviously, of Mr. Bloom's pockets. The old gold watch, a note-case, a silver toothpick, a bunch of keys. I see them all. But I see even more distinctly a Yale key. Never until this moment had it occurred to me that Mr. Bloom himself might have been responsible for the loss of my key, that he had in fact purloined it. I stole nearer and examined it. Was this mine? I was uncertain. I must risk it. The footsteps seemed now to be thumping down the stairs, and it was unmistakably his voice that I heard. Yes, yes, coming, coming! Well, I had no wish to meddle in any assignation. What, as I turned round, I was not prepared for was the spectacle of Mr. Bloom's bed. When I entered the room, I am certain that it had been empty. Not so now. The lower part was entirely flat, but on the pillow, the grey-flecked beard protruding over the turned-down sheet now showed what appeared to be the head of Mr. Bloom. It was a flawless facsimile, waxen, motionless. But it was not real. It was an hallucination. How induced is quite another matter, but it was inconceivably shocking. This house was not haunted. It was infested. Without another glance at the bed, I made my way as rapidly as possible to the door and broke into a run. Just as I had left her the previous evening, my car stood awaiting me beneath the porch. My heart literally stood still as I inserted the key. But all was well. The first faint purring of the engine was accompanied by the sound of a window being flung open. It was above me and behind me. I turned my head and detected a greyish figure standing within the trees, but he too may have been pure illusion. When I blinked and looked again, he was gone, but the gabbling was increasing overhead. In an instant I'd shot out from under the porch and was on my way down the drive, but to my utter confusion the gates at the end of it were heavily padlocked. I all but stripped the gears in my haste to retreat, and then, without so much as turning my head towards the house, I drove clean across the lawn. In 5 minutes I must have been nearly as many miles from Mr. Bloom's precincts. It was fortunate perhaps the day was so early. Even the most phlegmatic of constables might look a little askance at a motorist desperately defying the speed limit in a purple dressing gown and red Morocco slippers. But I was innocent of robbery, for in exchange for these articles I had left behind a valuable jacket and a pair of leather shoes. I wonder what they'll fetch at the sale. I wonder if Mr. Bloom would have offered me Mr. Champney's £300 per annum if I had consented to stay. He was sorely in need, I'm afraid, of human company. But I ran away. Now it's too late to make amends. He has gone home, as we all shall, and taken his wages. And what troubles me is the thought of Miss Allgood. She dabbled her fingers in the obscure waters frequented by Mr. Bloom. I hate to think of the possibility of her meeting him. For whatever Mr. Bloom's company in his charming house may have consisted of, and here edges in the obscure problem of what the creatures of our thoughts are made on. And quite apart, too, from Mr. Bloom's character and effects, my chief quarrel with him was his scorn of my harmless old friend. I would like, if only I could, to warn her against him. Those affectionate, saddened, hungry eyes.